Berlin, early summer 1948. The city breathes in dust and doubt, divided into 4 sectors yet beating with one exhausted heart. Every step clicks on broken glass while tomorrow feels like a bet whispered in ruins. In quiet offices, decisions fall like iron keys on stone corridors. Then, almost overnight, a door slams on 2 million lives, and a new chapter of the Cold War opens without a single shot. How did a shared victory in 1945 turn into a silent siege in 1948? The answer begins with a fragile system designed to work by unanimity in a world that could no longer agree. Germany was cut into 4 occupation zones, and Berlin was a 4-power island inside the Soviet zone. The Allied Control Council could act only when all 4 concurred, which made procedure a battlefield and protocol a weapon. By 1946, lines hardened as coal trains left the Soviet zone as reparations while dismantling of factories started in the West. Every machine unbolted and every wheel removed was more than metal. It was punctuation in a fast-cooling alliance. In June 1947, the Marshall Plan turned up the light on this uneasy stage. Moscow saw an anti-communist economic clamp, while Washington saw a lifeline against hunger and political chaos. In January 1947, the Bizone fused the American and British zones into a single administrative unit. It looked like efficiency on paper and rang like a warning bell in Moscow's ears because planning power was moving westward. France edged closer and talk of a tri-zone thickened the air. To Soviet planners, it sounded like nails tapping on the coffin of a unitary 4-power Germany. Inside the Allied Control Council, agendas grew longer and patience shorter. On the 20th of March 1948, the Soviet delegation walked out, and their footsteps kept echoing in rooms where decisions could no longer be made. Why did currency become the spark in this powder room? Because money is not just paper. It is the grammar of prices, wages, bread, and the sovereignty to decide them. Black markets and cigarette currency had already hollowed out the Reichsmark in the western zones. Planners in Frankfurt drew a hard conclusion. Without a stable currency, there is no planning, and without planning, there is no recovery. On the 20th of June 1948, the Deutsche Mark landed in the western zones and gave prices back their meaning. Old notes slid across counters and new notes returned like promises, while kitchen clocks and hopes were wound at the same time. Berlin, split but breathing, became a collision point the moment the western sectors prepared to adopt the DM. On 23 June, the Soviet side introduced the Ostmark in its zone and in East Berlin, and the next day the West brought the Deutsche Mark into its sectors of the city. How do 2 monetary systems coexist on the same tram line and the same market stall? They do not for long, and friction becomes policy the instant paper meets reality. At sector crossings, a new kind of customs barrier grew out of thin air. Shopkeepers began to ask not only about price and quality, but also about stamps, seals, and which money counted on which side of a street. The Soviet leadership called the Western currency move a provocation that rewrote the Berlin balance without consent. The stage was set, the scenery in place, and the night of orders and checkpoints could now lift the curtain on the blockade. What exactly happened in those decisive hours of June 1948? First came trains that did not move, phones that drowned in static, clearances that suddenly did not exist. In the night of 23rd to 24th June, Soviet authorities halted freight traffic to West Berlin and cut electric power coming from surrounding plants. On 25th June, inland shipping was tightened by lock controls on the Havel and the Elbe, and trucks formed mute queues under watchtowers. Road, rail, and water were labeled the same, temporarily unavailable. The reasons sounded technical: inspections, safety checks, capacity issues. Yet their sum wrote a political sentence any Berlin family could read. West Berlin was meant to be starved economically and softened politically until it yielded. It was an old siege logic played with modern switches and clipboards, not cannons and ladders. What did Moscow really aim to achieve? undo the Western currency change in Berlin, or make it so costly that it would be reversed. There was a second aim beyond money: push the Western allies to abandon their Berlin posts without a shot fired. Control on the ground was meant to outweigh legal lines on paper, and time would be the instrument of pressure. Legally, the terrain was knotty. Four-power status in Berlin stood beside access practices that had been used since 1945 but never fully codified for road and rail. Air corridors existed by agreement from 1945, a detail that mattered more with every frozen rail yard. On the ground, habits were not a treaty, and the blockade tightened exactly where ambiguity left room. Behind the scenes, bureaucracies worked to a cold metronome. Lists of coal, potatoes, medicine, and flour fed into quiet instructions that turned everyday movement into a maze. Whoever controls supplies manages time, and whoever manages time sets the political pulse. The pressure was meant to be clinical enough to deny the word attack while making retreat look rational. Why did the Western powers refuse to yield when the routes were closed? Because Berlin was both a city and a promise to people who had begun to depend on free institutions and a free press. Because yielding to access pressure would set a precedent that future crises would exploit. Because credibility of the Marshall Plan and the emerging Western integration was tied to a small island on the map with an outsized symbolic weight. They leaned on the guaranteed air corridors and the continuity of four-power rights. They also understood that logistics could speak more persuasively than speeches if it kept a steady rhythm. How did the beginning feel to people who did not sit in map rooms but lived in stairwells and kitchens? A father touched a fuse box on 24th June and watched light flicker and die, and suddenly electricity had a politics you could see. A shopkeeper counted rolls at dawn while deliveries shrank faster than hope. A child asked why the train would not come, and the answer was politics without saying the word. Smells shifted across the city. Less coal smoke, more damp cellar walls, more cold coffee and chipped cups. Sounds hardened into metal on metal as trucks turned back and voices grew louder at checkpoints. Newspapers printed fewer pages for lack of paper, yet news traveled faster on stairwells and markets. A rhythm of prudence took hold in which each tin, each candle, each bar of soap became a little plan. Why does this story still matter beyond the archive of dates? Because it shows how fragile access becomes when infrastructure turns into a political weapon. Supply chains are not neutral when pressure rises. They become levers that move cities and bend calendars. De-escalation sometimes begins with reliability rather than volume, with cadence rather than slogans. Every few years, the world changes names, but the mechanics of pressure and counterweight remain stubbornly familiar. Then the instruments were blockade and air corridor. Today, they often spell sanctions, export controls, and network resilience. The question of how to sustain a free city without firing back has echoes in newer crises. Berlin's first nights of blockade became a lesson in steadiness, logistics skill, and quiet communication that would soon reshape strategy. How did the blockade start in administrative detail rather than grand theory? With orders to border guards, instructions to dispatchers, and stamps that suddenly required new fields. With switchboards in suburban substations clicked to off by hands no one had noticed until that moment. With missing seals, new forms, and questions for truckers that had never been asked about origin, destination, and purpose. Clerks read new circulars at dawn that had been typed at night under harsh lamps. Forwarders fielded calls demanding clarifications for cargoes that yesterday were routine and today were suspect. The sum of small obstructions added up to a great stillness, matter of fact and deniable. Yet every idle locomotive and every closed lock was a link in a chain that bound a city. What did Berliners think of the opposing sides in those first days? Their answers were as layered as the city itself, running from bitterness to pragmatic calm, from fear to a humor that survives by looking forward. Some waited for the powerful to come to their senses. Others built neighborly lifelines with water buckets and shared stoves. It was a population that had survived war and understood the grammar of scarcity without romanticizing it. A radio set on a stair landing became a public voice that dripped numbers like water from a tap. Doctors dosed reassurance as carefully as they measured tablets, giving sentences that explained what was happening and what to do next. Teachers turned arithmetic into ration planning and wrote examples in chalk shaped like cans and loaves. On markets, new price balances emerged that owed less to supply and more to access. Why did this beginning not end in capitulation, but in a counter-move that would soon be called the airlift? Because a heavy decision on switchboards provoked a light decision on runways, where time could be kept in minutes, not months. From a broken road, a sky route appeared, improbable at first, then dependable, and finally emblematic. The signal sent in those days was not loud, but regular, and rhythm can be more convincing than noise. In the end, one insight reached beyond Berlin. Close one path and you compel your opponent to build another, and sometimes the new path proves stronger than the old. The blockade tried to quiet the city, but it made the city audible because every arriving ton would soon become a sentence mark. It left a discreet lesson that returns whenever freedom and supply share the same sentence in any crisis. It did not begin with tanks, but with papers, switches, and stamps that stopped working. And it continued because a city, 3 Western powers, and uncounted hands decided that access is not only a route, but a promise kept in motion. Why is that promise still ours to keep now? Because whenever pressure tightens around corridors and cables, the calm that carried Berlin through its first hours of the blockade may be the difference between a city that waits in darkness and a city that learns to breathe again.